Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We know your time is very precious and you all have businesses to run. The fact that you're here suggests that you're all looking for some kind of direction. This is going to be the first of 3 sessions on the same topic. And we hope at the very least today to provide you with a starting point in terms of navigating the new landscape of food manufacturing. On your right-hand side, there is a questions button. Please feel free to post any questions you may have throughout the presentations, and we will attempt to get to all of the questions at the end of the webinar, which will be recorded, by the way, and we will share with you at the end. My name is Caroline. I've been a social emotional skills specialist for the past 7 years. Social emotional learning focuses on intrapersonal relationships, and it used to be thought of as a soft skill, but now has become a dominant success determinant in the business world. In fact, Google lists social emotional learning and the ability to collaborate effectively as their top hiring criteria, the ability to keep it together. But times are uncertain and humans don't like uncertainty. We like direction and clear maps, even though men don't like to admit that. Clear maps, comfort zones, but everything's been toppled upside down. And many of us are feeling like headless chicken, running around directionless, not knowing how to navigate this foreign landscape. And it's terrifying. Globally, the rate of anxiety has almost doubled in the last 6 months. The last measure taken in December 2019 had the anxiety levels globally at around 35%, and now the global rate amongst adults and children has gone up to almost 70%. We can't function optimally when we are anxious. Our workforce is scared of going to work if they're still lucky enough to have work in the first place, scared of going home from work in case they bring a virus home to their elderly parents or children, scared of their colleagues who used to be their best friend because now that best friend is a threat, scared of not being the most brilliant home educator in the world because you weren't geared for that. And all of these emotions are just overwhelming. We often hear people say, it's not personal, it's just business. Wrong. Business is very personal. It's now even more personal than it ever has been. Not just because business is run by people and people are emotional creatures, but also because our identities are tied to what we do. So now, more than ever, we need to be taking into account mental and emotional well-being of our staff, as well as their physical staff, as part of your continuous improvement strategy. Because if we don't, it's going to lead to some kind of breakdown. We are instinctually geared to reduce pain and seek pleasure. Stop cringing. And to do this, we have to have certain needs fulfilled. So if we compare Maslow's hierarchy of needs to the typical framework of a food factory, there's quite a close correlation in terms of personal well-being and the well-being of the entire business. Our basic needs include things like the needs for food, water, energy, security, and the factory, which is the guts of the business, also needs supply of food, raw materials, energy, water, security, and then of the obvious safety measures apart from COVID, all the safety measures and quality checks that have to go into the food production, as well as the equipment that needs to process all these things effectively to make sure that the entire business is safe. The psychological needs like respect, love, friendship, intimate connections are very much like the relationships you've forged with your suppliers and your customers, all of which are built on trust and which will determine the way your business is perceived in the community. The self-actualization aspect is where the company's vision is accomplished. And obviously, it's going to need redirecting in difficult times like this. So we need to be adaptable. No single aspect is more or less important than the other. And they're all interdependent, just as we are. We are social creatures, and we need to rely on each other for support. But given all of the stresses we're facing right now, it's almost inevitable that we're going to fall apart at some point. As individuals, as businesses, there are going to be breaking points, and that's okay. I had my own little breakdown a while ago, and actually I realized that that's quite beneficial, because breakdowns can lead to breakthroughs, because they highlight where your vulnerabilities lie, where the cracks are, and which areas need more focused development. The first element of social emotional learning is self-awareness, knowing what your triggers are, where your strengths lie, and where you might need help. Something as seemingly insignificant as a stubbed toe, for example, can slow the pace of the whole organization if it's gone unchecked. If you're trying to run a marathon with a stubbed toe, can you push through? Can you get to the end and just push the pain aside and soldier on? Yes, of course you can. But are you going to be functioning optimally so that you can win the goal, which is your initial mission, your vision? Certainly not. It's going to be a nagging hindrance all the time until it's attended to. And it takes courage to acknowledge pain and to look at that offending toe and deal with the pain. But it goes a long way to providing clarity, some sense of control, and a degree of certainty that we're all craving right now. Even if that certainty is we have a stubbed toe, at least it's a starting point of acknowledging what needs attention. So self-awareness in terms of personal well-being and a broader awareness in terms of the business's well-being goes a long way to achieving some kind of certainty and direction when we're feeling directionless. So I focused a little bit on the internal aspects of this new landscape. I'm going to hand over to Dilley Naidoo, who is the CEO of Madala Associates, and he'll be taking a broader look at the new landscape of food manufacturing. Thanks, Dilley.
Good morning, all. Good morning, all. You've heard from Caroline, who's touched on the human side, the people side, and I'm going to be touching on some of the COVID challenges on the business side. So I'm going to, in the 10 minutes that I have allotted to me, talk a little bit of the impact on the economy, and I'm going to touch a little bit on the impact on you, the food processing businesses. There is no doubt that globally, the world has been impacted from an economic perspective. If we look closer to South Africa and we look at the sector damages that have been done. The mining sector has decreased. The agricultural sector has been impacted. There's a reduction in tourism. There's less travel and transportation and logistics. There's also a high incidence of unemployment. And of course, this has had a high fiscal impact and fewer investor confidence. So if you look at South Africa at this stage, there is, in the last 35 years, probably the lowest consumer confidence, and global GDP growth at this stage in the developing entities are forecast to be less than 7% GDP growth. Now, if you look at South Africa, we were already on negative ground pre-COVID. So you can imagine if the first world countries are expecting a negative GDP growth of 7%, what is going to be the growth impact negatively for South Africa? So I guess you're all very familiar with this big picture that I've presented. But what I would like to do is share my personal observations in the plants that I visited during the COVID period, the food processing sectors. And there's definitely been a supply side disruption. So if you've been importing products from outside South Africa, given the lockdowns, there's been a tremendous supply shortage, and all the logistics, whether it was air freighted or through the sea freights. There was an initial supply side demand, and people went around, going and buying more than they actually require selfishly. But there's also been a decline in demand. So if you look at these uncertain times, how do you plan as a production house? It is very, very difficult, and it's challenging. And there's also pent-up customer expectations. So customers have now got different expectations from you as a supplier. This has obviously led to business liquidity and cash flow issues. So if you look at your fixed costs versus your declining revenue base, it's definitely impacting businesses in terms of sustainability and future growth. And this could potentially lead to a classic demand-side multiplier effect. So how do you plan for this, and are you ready for this if this positively happens? So COVID-19 has also accelerated the need for business alignment and integration. And COVID-19 has exposed a number of companies that had either silos or divisions that did not work as one cohesive integrated unit. So what you need to look at as a business today in the food processing sector is how aligned is your entire business. As basic as it sounds, is revisiting your original business models and your current business models and asking the questions, what is the purpose of my business? Why do I exist? What are the capabilities that I have within my organization to satisfy my customer needs? What are the current resources that I have, whether it's automation in your factory floor, IT systems, etc.? And what are the management capabilities that can highlight some of the challenges so I can take very quick corrective action? So this has really highlighted the need for accelerated integration. I want to give you an example of a company that most of you are familiar with, McDonald's. McDonald's started in 1955 in California by two brothers when I was 1 year old. So it's a 65-year-old company. And the whole purpose of McDonald's vision at the time was to basically have a drive-through fast takeaway. And over the years, McDonald's now serves almost 1% of the world population, in excess of 70 million customers every day in almost every country. So what is the difference with McDonald's? And what are the lessons that we can learn from companies like McDonald's? Firstly, they are fanatical about the attention to the way they design their operations. the flow of the operation from the time they receive the goods to the time they serve their customer. The investment in their management and their management philosophy. They've paid very great attention to their systems and processes, which allows them to have a seamless flow through from the time you place your order to the time you consume your food. And as you would know, in the food business, it's based on routine. You almost do the same thing almost every single day, or if you're running multiple shifts, the difference may be on the different product lines that you run. Last but not least is something that Caroline touched on, the human element. So if you look at McDonald's, the worker culture, so if you visited McDonald's in the US, in Europe, in Asia, whether it is China, India, etc., although there are natives of those countries with different dialects and accents, the workers have a McDonald's culture. So the question you should be asking for yourself, what is the culture, the worker culture, and is that culture consistent across my organization? So if we look at McDonald's today, 65 years later, they have 35,000 locations spread across over 100 countries. And what is the reason for this? So if we revisit the success of McDonald's and we look at their purpose, and this is something that even we as an organization have been looking at, is what do we do and why do we do this? McDonald's consistently looks at this. And what is our business strategy to support the business purpose? What are we trying to win to further our purpose? And what are the capabilities that we have? What do we need to be good at winning in this market sector? And McDonald's has competitors in this sector, both in their domestic markets and globally. And what are the operational and financial management systems that allows them to measure the performance? So if you look at the entire business value chain, there is no single point of failure. So if you look at your businesses, and if you've got some weak links, that is going to have an impact on ultimately customer satisfaction, brand enhancement, or damage to brand because of some of the weak links that you may have within your system. So I think there's a number of learnings that we can take from a philosophy perspective from McDonald's as an entity. If we look at the food sector market, in my opinion, it's probably one of the only markets in the world where the world's your oyster. The global population today is just under 8 billion people. Now, I know I have almost 3 meals a day. I have some breakfast meals, I have lunch, and I have dinner on average. And those are 3 different products that I consume during each one of those breakfast, lunch, and dinner meals. If we look at South Africa, there are approximately 60 million people. And if we look at Africa as a continent, there's 1.2 billion people. So there are very few industry sectors that has got such a large marketplace opportunity. The challenge for you is to carve out the market space that you want to play within this global marketplace. And food is a moral right of all who are born into this world. The question is, do you know what your customers expect? So I would suggest, based on the short presentation that I've given you, that you should be considering and revisiting your business model, which is now highly impacted during COVID, but more importantly, how do you prepare post-COVID? That concludes my presentation. I would now like to introduce Professor Lucia Ulrich. Lucy is a microbiologist, and she focuses in the food sector, specifically in the safety area, in the certification area, and the training area. I'll now hand you over to Professor Lucia Ulrich.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dilley, for that kind introduction. Apologies, I just want to get the system rolling. There we go. So I will be covering this morning something on the virus, but specifically asking what is it that we can control during this COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently experiencing. So there is so much new information that is literally being developed on a daily basis that what is true today may not actually be true tomorrow, because there is so little known of this virus that we are constantly learning. So I try to keep information as updated as possible on my website. So please know that what we discuss today might actually be different in a few days' time regarding the virus. And a very good example is the fact that it was not believed to be airborne by so many people, many scientists, including the World Health Organization. And you might have heard or read in the last day or two that there are around 200 scientists in America who are believing and have apparently evidence to show that the virus is in fact airborne. And this actually changes the picture quite dramatically. And it would probably affect absolutely everyone that goes into a room or sits in a meeting where the virus can potentially circulate. So the purpose of my presentation is really to create a background and an understanding and awareness of the virus that causes COVID-19 disease in order to assist senior management in making and implementing effective decisions to protect employees, but also to continue with their businesses in a profit-making environment. So some background on previous coronavirus outbreaks. First of all, the coronaviruses is a very large group of family of viruses. And the normal human coronaviruses are those that cause the common cold and have been doing so for decades. However, we know that viruses from time to time can jump from animals to humans. And when they do that, because we are not exposed to them prior to that, we do not have an immunity against them. And that is why when these viruses jump, they actually cause severe disease in humans. So the first SARS virus came out in 2003 in China. It caused an outbreak in China with around 10% mortality. The Middle East respiratory syndrome virus was the second one that jumped from camels to humans, and it caused an outbreak in 2012. And there were far fewer cases. There were about 2,800 cases in total. And if you look at what we have currently with our coronavirus 2, at the moment, it's more than 11 million people across the world. So in terms of people affected, the MERS virus affected far fewer, but its mortality rate was quite high. 34% of the people who got it died from it. And it was confined mainly to the Arabian Peninsula simply because it was associated with camels. And then the third virus that we are currently experiencing is the SARS-CoV-2. So that's the name it's been given to it to distinguish it from the first SARS virus, which is actually sometimes referred to now as SARS-CoV-1. So that's the name of the virus that we call colloquially the coronavirus. And it's currently causing about a 2 to 3% mortality, and it differs from country to country. In some countries, it's up to 5%, and in South Africa, even it's much lower than even 2%. So it's constantly changing. So we actually don't know at the end of the day what the final mortality rate will be. And of course, this occurred last year and in China as well. The disease it causes is then called COVID-19. And I want to make it clear right from the start that this is primarily a respiratory illness. It does affect a lot of organs in the human body. It can even affect the vascular system, but the actual origin of the virus is in a respiratory environment. So the main symptoms have been up to now, but they've also changed. coughs and fever. In some cases, there is no fever until quite late in the incubation time, and then the shortness of breath. But chills and muscle pains and sore throat, fatigue, headache, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, for example, have all been listed as symptoms of this virus. And in fact, new loss of taste or smell has been added to the list of main symptoms pretty recently by the CDC in Atlanta and some other countries as well. And of course, when it gets really very severe, it affects the lungs and can cause pneumonia. We've seen the ability of this virus to cause clotting in the blood. So some people eventually die from strokes, even though they didn't have any potential prior to contracting the virus for any kind of stroke occurring. So it has got a number of effects that we are still trying to understand. So current transmission still remains person to person via touching, shaking hands, hugging, and so on. And then droplets from coughing or sneezing. And up to now, it's been particularly within 2 meters, because the idea has been, or the belief has been, that the large droplets drop within 1 meter to 2 meters. They fall to the ground, and so they do not get distributed beyond that distance. However, this new thinking that it might be airborne might actually change the belief around the way it is transmitted. And that is why currently we have been emphasizing the importance of social distancing in all environments, including in a food processing environment. Contaminated surfaces has also been touted as a way of transmission, but I've put a question mark there because the CDC in Atlanta, the New Zealand authorities, and many others are actually starting to believe that contaminated surfaces may not actually play such a huge role in comparison to the above 2 ways of transmission. And in fact, McKinsey developed a report in May this year in which they showed that 40% of transmission is from symptomatic individuals, and 45% and 5% respectively are from pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic. Now, there's been a lot of debate around what the terminology is that we should be using when we say that someone doesn't show any symptoms at a particular point in time. And really and truly, it doesn't matter what you call these people. The fact is that they might develop symptoms, often showing none, or they might actually never show symptoms and still have tested positive for the virus. But I'm interested in this 10% over here, which says that actually 10% of transmission is environmental, and that includes surfaces. So this is almost in line with what the CDC and the New Zealand authorities are believing, that surfaces might not actually be playing such a huge role. So when it comes to food safety, there is currently no evidence that the virus causing COVID-19 is in fact transmitted to humans via food or food packaging, in spite of the fact that we know that the virus can survive on certain surfaces for certain periods of time. So we do not regard it as a foodborne virus. Things like norovirus and hepatitis A are typically foodborne viruses, and we do not see that occurring with this current SARS-CoV-2. So it remains primarily a respiratory illness. And a lot of food safety authorities across the world concur with this idea. The question then has been raised, what about infected food handlers in my factory? Well, it's acknowledged, of course, that if a person is coughing over food that is open, or even packaged food for that matter, that there is, of course, a potential that virus can land on that food. But even so, there's still no evidence that a person can become infected via eating food containing this virus. And there are a number of factors that play a role. The gastric juices, for a start, are very acidic, and the virus does not fare well below a pH of 3. So our stomach acid is around pH of 2. So it would be enough to kill the virus. The virus in food is likely at very low concentrations, and it is less available to host cells when in a food matrix in comparison to when it's carried in respiratory droplets. And then there are other factors which I will not go into today. So the greatest risk remains person-to-person transmission. And that is what one needs to focus on in a food manufacturing and or retail environment. So early in April, I developed an infographic, an A4 infographic and an A3 poster for industry that you can download for free from my website. It's available in English, Zulu, and in French for my African colleagues that are Francophone countries. And it has a number of useful tips for workers to the do's and the don'ts, as well as reminding people as to when they should actually be washing their hands in a food factory environment. So most food businesses have some sort of food safety management system in place. They are usually based on a HACCP system, HACCP, but regardless of the sophistication of the food safety management system, they are all based on good hygiene practices. And this is the time now when we need to reinforce the back to basics idea, where we instill a hygiene culture in our workers and in our organization, because it's important to prevent any contamination of food, regardless of SARS-CoV-2. There are many bacteria out there that cause foodborne disease, and we've been teaching the food industry for decades to wash their hands with soap and water for 20 seconds. I have slide presentations where I've been training people, and we put actually in those slides, sing happy birthday twice. So this is nothing actually new for the food industry, but what we do need to do is to go back to that and reinforce and reinforce and retrain. And in some cases, even after washing hands with soap and water, we still require some workers to sanitize their hands where required with a minimum of 60% alcohol. And in South Africa now, the requirement by law is a minimum of 70% alcohol. And therefore, you know, a number of requirements have been promulgated and a number of regulations. The first one that came out for the Department of Employment and Labor was on the 15th of March, and it was subsequently updated on the 29th of April 2020, and after that, the 4th of June. So the one on the 4th of June, R639, is the latest Department of Employment and Labor regulation that requires a risk assessment to be done in your factory, and it has a lot of different requirements for different size businesses. And the purpose of these regulations is really to prevent the escalation of COVID-19 infections in the workplace. And this new regulation promulgated on the 4th of June now requires companies to also do a risk assessment for age and comorbidity risk. So I have a number of risk assessment templates that I use to assist businesses to actually do this risk assessment for age and comorbidity, where the illness of the individual is pitched against the exposure probability, depending on the type of job the person has, and one can then determine the risk that that person might actually contract the disease, and if they do, what kind of potential outcome could occur due to the person's vulnerability or not. So a number of protocols have had to be developed by industry because of COVID-19. And these are, for example, cleaning and disinfection protocols that might be completely different to what they were before. For a first time, a mask management protocol, because masks were not needed beforehand. Now we do have to wear masks in these environments. So people have to understand how to put it on, how to take it off hygienically. They must wash their hands before, they must wash their hands after, etc., etc. And these masks, if they are surgical masks and only a once-use mask, is it going to be treated as medical waste by that food facility? And if so, how is that medical waste going to have to be disposed of? What about social distancing according to the law? How do we separate people from one another if we can't maintain a social distance of at least 1.5 meters? The training, how does training change? The delivery method as well. What kind of language? Caroline mentioned people, cultures. How do people understand what is being said in a training module depending on their cultural beliefs? Creating a safe environment in the workspace. What to do when a positive employee is identified? What protocol then kicks in? How about hotspots? Have companies identified various hotspots like breathalyzers for testing people for alcohol usage when they come on site? Can those breathalyzers, if they're being used from one person to another person, is it possible to distribute the virus via these breathalyzers? So these are all important new protocols that have to be thought of. So all in all, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a huge number of challenges, and it has created a system where we need to balance everything. There is certainly a paradigm shift that has been undergone by so many businesses across the board. There is a new normal that we are now talking about. What does this new normal look like? We have to navigate Department of Health and Department of Employment and Labor regulations. So sometimes DEL has a regulation or a requirement that is not stipulated by the Department of Health, and vice versa. You might find the Department of Health stipulates something related to personnel that these regulations do not relate to. So how does one navigate the two and others as well to make sense of all of these things? And changes to any guidelines. Just yesterday, the NICD made it very clear that after the 14-day period of illness, when you have been identified as a positive COVID-19 patient, and you've been at home and you've been quarantined at home, that you no longer need to be tested after the 14-day period before you return to work. About a month ago, it was a requirement, now no longer. So these are things that constantly change. How do we keep updated with all these new requirements and guidelines? So the Balancing Act is very much a question of protecting employees, complying to all the different regulations that you may or may not even be aware of, including all the food safety requirements, because food safety continues in this environment, while still trying to conduct business and remain profitable. And it is very, very much about organizational culture, how your organization operates in these times, and how resilient is it? What systems are in place in order to absorb such shocks, or in fact to lessen the impact of such shocks that occur? So, and trust me, in future we're going to have more of these, because these viruses will continue to pop out from time to time. Just in 2009, there was the H1N1 pandemic, and it was a pandemic. It was not an epidemic. And about 575,000 people died. So what have we learned from these pandemics? Not much, but we're learning a lot from this one. And how that's incorporated into the culture of an organization is absolutely critical for the viability of the business. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and you're welcome to visit my website where services and courses, etc., are laid out, and you are most welcome to also contact me should you wish to have any information, any further information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. You would notice that I have my South African ethnic design face mask. Our next speaker for this morning is James Wood. James Wood is based outside Birmingham in the UK. He's an executive at Aptean, and he has a number of years of global experience in the food processing sector. James, over to you.
Thanks, Dilley. Can I ask Professor to advance my slides?
James, I'm busy looking at that at the moment. Apologies.
Okay. Just while you're doing that, a quick introduction. So as Dilley mentioned, I work for a company called Aptean. We partner with Dilley's company down in South Africa, and we specifically provide solutions for primarily food and beverage manufacturers. So a lot of what has been talked about so far, we're very kind of in tune with, and we can use our systems to kind of take some of these things forward, particularly with what Professor Lucia's just talked around. But we'll talk to that as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So typically, we come out and visit kind of food and beverage manufacturers, and we're there to provide value and benefit to your business through the systems that we provide. Could you advance the slide on, Professor? Thanks. So obviously, typically your challenge within your business is around exceeding your customer and your shareholder expectations. You want to expand your businesses. You want to obviously expand the markets and the verticals that you operate in, and obviously, you know, there's a real challenge to maximize the throughput through the factory there. You're kind of doing that in the face of what we see as being upward trends for things like raw material costs, energy distribution. You're being squeezed by the people that you're supplying to produce things at the lowest possible price point. So that there's always a squeeze on the margins that you're trying to achieve within your production facilities. We do see on the softer side now, there's kind of millennials coming through. There are people that expect to be able to use systems within their manufacturing shop floor operations that are very akin to what they would use at home. So many people have tablets, laptops at home. So kind of when we see millennials using software, we know that they expect to use it in a certain way. They can consume information very quickly. It's data that's available in real time. So we really see that providing that to the younger workforce that is out there on the shop floor now has a huge benefit and helps to drive decision making out there on the shop floor. We see changes in the digital aspects of what's happening within production facilities as well. The data that you need to drive and improve and optimize your business is actually there and available to you now, but the systems that we provide are very much around unlocking that data and giving you access to that data that is already within your facility, but it just needs to be presented in a way that is consumable and can be used to drive real change within your business. Next slide, please, Professor. So when we come out and talk to businesses and food manufacturers, we see a very typical solution landscape. Typically, you know, we're going in and there will be ERP systems in place. There will be systems for running the sales and demand planning side of the business, the logistics operation. There might be an APS solution for providing the production plan to the shop floor. And very typically, certainly within food factories, there will be a level of automation and control that is responsible for driving the equipment and the machines that you have producing your goods. What we often see is once that production plan gets released to the shop floor, it really becomes a black hole of information. People can't get a picture of what's happening, how far through the production plan are we, where are our inefficiencies, where do we need to improve, what's the data telling us about when we run this particular product on this particular line. And really what we do with our Aptean solution that we're talking specifically about today, Factory MES, is really shine a light onto the shop floor operations. So that kind of in a nutshell is where Aptean fit in. We really provide visibility through the entire supply chain, but specifically within the shop floor operation. Next slide, please. We see trends within digital technology. So there are various reasons why people are implementing solutions into their factories. We've seen a shift from people using local servers to cloud computing. We want people to have more remote access to machine controls. We want to move away from paper-based records on the shop floor and throughout the business to something that's electronic, that is easily accessible. And they're kind of the key things that people are looking to change within their facility. But obviously over over the course of the last 3 to 6 months, we've seen a huge change because of what COVID has done. But actually what we're seeing is those drivers for change within the business are actually being helped in a kind of back to front way by what's happened with the COVID pandemic. So if you could advance to the next slide. So we've seen many businesses be hit by COVID, and as Dilley mentioned earlier, that within the food space there is an increased demand for products because people have a right to eat. They expect to eat 3 meals a day. We've certainly seen a spike in demand. People are buying up products from food manufacturers to in some cases stockpile and fill their store cupboards because they're so worried about what's happening with COVID. Certainly what we've seen from a systems perspective is that people now want to move away from relying on IT to run their business and kind of pass it on to a solution vendor that can do the whole thing for them. So they want to be able to access their systems from anywhere. They want to be able to do it just via an internet link. So that's kind of played into what we're experiencing within our customer base. Next slide, please. Could you build the slide for me, Professor? So really, if we talk about what we've seen over the course of going into the COVID pandemic, and then as the COVID pandemic has hit us, as I mentioned, people want to be paperless on the shop floor. They want to free up their teams to move away from non-value add activities like filling in spreadsheets, filling in paperwork. That extends out to the quality side as well. So Professor Lucia talked around food safety on the shop floor is extremely important now. And we've certainly seen that people can use our systems to drive that behavior change on the shop floor, where people need to know they have to wash their hands every 30 minutes. They have to have a standard operating procedure for how they put a mask on, how they fit a mask, how should they socially distance within the factory. So we're hearing about all these things that we used to hear, but that has also been extended now. And if you could build the slide further, Professor. We kind of see that with the COVID pandemic, there are things that we're hearing that are very common throughout food businesses where we can help. So, you know, we're hearing that food manufacturers are having a spike in demand. In some instances, it's kind of double-digit increase in percentage demand. And they can't cope because of the systems that they have on the shop floor are just not lending themselves to providing visibility and optimization of production. So where we've got customers that are using our systems, they've actually seen that for them to pivot onto that increased demand that COVID has caused, it's not caused them a problem at all because they've got information that is available. They don't need IT to run their systems. You know, they can access it from anywhere. So all of that information that is helping them optimize and cope with that increased demand, we've been helping to provide them through the solution set that we provide. So we've really seen that people still want visibility into the shop floor. They still want to transition to electronic systems. They obviously want to improve their efficiency and their capacity to produce. But we've actually seen that the increased demand that COVID has brought to those manufacturers, they've been able to cope from having those systems in place. Next slide, please. So at Aptean, could you build it all the way through, Professor? So at Aptean, kind of what's included in our product suite. So we effectively take care of infrastructure. So, you know, not having that reliance on IT, we will take care of that for our customer base. We can scale it very easily. You know, we can start off small. We can go from a single site implementation to a multi-site, multi-geography implementation very, very quickly. We have the ability to keep people up to date. So provide updates to the solutions that we have and push those updates out without kind of getting on the phone to IT and scheduling in an upgrade. We can do it very easily. High availability of the systems. So kind of, as I mentioned, data is key. People want visibility into that data, and that they want it to be available all of the time. So we provide very high availability solutions so that people can see exactly how their businesses are performing from day to day. And really things like disaster recovery, security protection, all of that is all encompassed within what we do. So we kind of provide the full end-to-end solution for businesses, certainly food businesses. Next slide. And we help businesses stay ahead of the competition. You know, they're future-proof solutions. We have huge investment in R&D. We build out the solutions to match what we're hearing out there in the marketplace. And there's really focused functionality for the food industry. And I think that the most pertinent point that I picked up on from the last presentation was what I mentioned around kind of food safety and capturing information to show that you as a business are doing everything that you can to adhere to these new regulations that are coming out around hand washing, people wearing masks, social distancing, providing information out to the teams on the shop floor, which kind of educate them on how they should do those things, but also log against each one of your production runs that you took that action when you were producing those products. So if anything comes back, if there's any recalls, if there's any questionability into the product that you produced, all of that information is logged electronically and can be retrieved at the click of a button. So people can come back and kind of say, well, we did absolutely everything we could. We educated our workforce. We did the full belt and braces approach. And here are the records to show that. So that's kind of where we're working within the industry, and that is really helping our customers stay ahead of their competition at the moment. I did want to just give you a very brief overview of some customer success that we've had with a company over in Europe called Intersnack. So Intersnack are the biggest producer of snack products in Europe. So they produce over 500,000 tons of snacks a year. They've got a head office in Dusseldorf in Germany. They are a collection of companies that have been acquired over the past 10 years. So there's kind of 14 individual management units and over 8,000 employees that certainly within the shop floor that we support their shop floor business from an end to end. So work that we did with Intersnack, so we did an initial 2-site test installation with Intersnack in the Netherlands in 2009. And based on the success of that solution going in, they decided to roll out and standardize on our MES platform. We've now rolled that out over the course of the last 10 years to now be present within 26 sites across Europe. And we're constantly scaling. So as I mentioned, it's very easy for us to go from a single site to a multi-site implementation, but also build with the business as we go, and introduce things like packaging, barcode validation, palletizer integration. And we could also extend that now to include kind of the quality testing that people are doing around the COVID pandemic measures that have been put in place over in Europe. So they were aggressively grown by acquisition. They had many disparate systems, so time-consuming operations. People were filling out spreadsheets. There was manual data entry. There was a very, very small amount of visibility into their production process, and that they really weren't engaged in the continuous improvement process. So, you know, they kind of put our solution in to give them visibility, as I mentioned on that first slide, to shine a light into production and to enable them to make key decisions, key management decisions based on real data, providing real evidence, as opposed to anecdotal evidence that was coming from the shop floor. Next slide. So Intersnack, across their enterprise have seen a 5 to 10% year-on-year increase in efficiency. So I'm sure you guys in the manufacturing space will understand OEE. our Dutch sites that initially started out around 25% efficient, using OEE as the efficiency metric. And they've grown now over the past 10 years to around mid-50s. So they've actually been improving their efficiency step by step, about 5% year on year. They've gone paperless on their shop floor. So they don't log downtime on paper. They don't log quality checks on paper. Everything is done within the system. There's standard working practices across the enterprise. Everybody understands how to log those things and how they will be measured on it. They've managed to improve their utilization of equipment and their personnel, so they experience less downtime. They've reduced their production costs as a result, and also they can better schedule their maintenance. And actually, they provide that immediate real-time feedback to the teams that means people can get involved and flag issues as they're occurring, rather than kind of see them happen and then they have to go away and find the right person. It's all electronic, and there's that kind of escalation mechanism through the solution itself. Next slide. I think certainly what we've seen, I mean, that's kind of a generic picture of the benefits they've seen throughout the Intersnack group, but certainly since COVID has struck as well, they've seen additional benefits. So they're kind of already ahead of their rivals because they've optimized their process. They're able to deal with that increased demand from COVID. They've had no issues with system access because they're not restricted by their on-premise IT. They're not reliant on their on-premise IT teams who are now working from home. The system is always available, and they've kind of just gone without missing a beat on the huge project that they've put in, huge change project that they've put in to implement Infor Cloud Suite across their enterprise and standardize on their ERP solution, to which Factory MES is integrated. That project has continued on completely unaffected by COVID, and that will continue to help drive optimization of production and help them to continue realizing those benefits year on year. So very quick whistle-stop tour of kind of Aptean, what we do, what the Factory MES solution can do, how it can help with optimization of production processes, but also how it's pivoted to help with kind of the COVID pandemic and making sure that you as a food producer can remain compliant and show that you've done everything that you need to do in these kind of new normal times. Okay, Dilley, I've gone over a little bit, but back to you.
Thank you, James. Sarah, we may have time for one or two questions.
Hi, everybody. Yes, there are a couple of questions that have come in from the questions box from the audience. Most of the questions actually have been answered by James's presentation, so thank you for that, James. One additional question that James may be able to answer is, do we offer a proof of value exercise, and typically how long does that take, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I can answer that. Did you say a business value exercise, Sarah? Yeah,
proof of value.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that, and it's something we've done successfully with a number of our customers over we kind of put it in place over the past 18 months. So we were being asked questions around, what's it going to look like on my shop floor, and really trying to get people to buy into a vision was helped by doing a proof of value exercise where we would come in and implement one production line in its entirety and set the system up and run it, and then over the course of 6 weeks just kind of look at the data that's being captured, look at the information that we're getting from the system and the input from the guys on the shop floor, and really use that information to put together return on investment calculations, kind of drive change within the 6-week period. So we've seen some great success where we did a one-line pilot that actually resulted in a 4% increase in OEE within those 6 weeks, which was huge. And within that 6-week period, we actually did a mini Kaizen campaign where we kind of identified one area that we could focus on, broke it down into more granular detail, and actually got to the root cause of a problem which they had no idea they were experiencing, which was around packaging being wet from being stored in a shed on site over a weekend, and it had rained, and they couldn't cope with putting the packaging into a machine when it was wet. So they actually went back to the packaging manufacturer and went from a brown box to a laminated box, which could cope with that additional dampness. And they managed to save, I think it was tens of hours of production just from going back and kind of making that analysis and that assessment, and stopping the machines jamming up with the wet brown boxes. So there's huge visibility and huge value we can provide just from doing a proof of value exercise on one line. And typically that is a 6-week period.
Thanks, James. Sarah, what I'm going to suggest in the interest of time, unless there's any other pressing questions that you have.
No, there's no other questions, Dilley.
Okay, so if you have any additional questions, please feel free to send them to Caroline at Rifle Shot. The next session that we planned is on the 23rd of July at the same time, 10 o'clock. And this will be focused on optimizing the operations of your plants, your factories, with a focus on improving efficiencies and effectiveness. We have a very good lineup of speakers, and we look forward to hosting you on the 23rd. We would like to take this opportunity to thank you for making the time and attending this presentation. And I'd also like to thank all the presenters today, and in particular to Aptean as a sponsor, together with the Rifle Shot as the sponsor. A special thank you to the professor who has shed a lot of very valuable information with regards to COVID-19. Thank you and stay safe. Bye-bye.